Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into two of the absolute most talked about mind-altering plants on Earth, cannabis and psilocybin. Now, because they're both ancient, they're both botanical, and they're both currently riding this massive wave of decriminalization, people tend to lump them together, right? Like they're just two different flavors of the exact same natural medicine. But if we actually look at the neuroscience, that couldn't be further from the truth. They operate in completely different pharmacological universes. I mean, they don't share a mechanism, they don't share a receptor, and they don't even share a neurotransmitter system.
I absolutely love this quote from our source material. Comparing them is less a contest than a study in how two entirely different keys open two entirely different doors in the same brain. And honestly, that's the fundamental premise of today's exploration. We're going to decouple these two substances by looking directly at the hard neuroscience. This isn't about which one is better, it's about understanding precisely how two entirely unrelated molecules rewire our experience through completely unrelated mechanisms.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the two universes. Second, the mechanisms. Third, dependence. Fourth, the clinical data. And finally, we'll wrap up with the 2026 laws.
So, moving right into section 1. Two different pharmacological universes, or the neurochemical divide.
We've got to establish this foundational difference right out of the gate, because this single divergence really explains almost everything else we're going to talk about. Here is the core neurochemical divide. First up, we have THC, the primary active component in cannabis. THC engages your endocannabinoid system. It acts as a partial agonist at your CB1 receptors, which essentially means it hijacks a lipid signaling network your brain is already using to regulate its own activity. Now, on the flip side, we have psilocybin. Psilocybin is actually a prodrug, meaning it's totally inert until your body strips off a phosphate group to create the active molecule, which is psilocin. Psilocybin engages an entirely different network, the serotonin system. It acts as a primary driver, an agonist, at the 5-HT2A serotonin receptors. So one is essentially a modulator, the other is a driver.
That brings us to section 2, borrowing versus flipping the switch, looking at the actual mechanisms of action. Now, what's really interesting about this is how these receptors manipulate your brain function in totally opposite directions. Let's look at cannabis first. The endocannabinoid system normally operates on this incredibly precise, self-limiting trick called retrograde signaling. Think of it like a backward-flowing feedback loop. When a neuron fires, it naturally produces its own cannabinoids, which drift backward across the synapse to the presynaptic terminal. It's essentially telling that terminal to turn down the volume and release fewer neurotransmitters, like GABA and glutamate. But when you introduce exogenous THC, it overrides this delicate system. It floods those CB1 receptors everywhere, all at once. It dampens and quiets the circuits, which, frankly, perfectly explains why you might walk into a room and completely forget why you're there. It reliably impairs short-term memory and coordination, but without suppressing your breathing, because CB1 receptors are dense in your cortex, but thankfully sparse in your brainstem.
Psilocybin, on the other hand, does the exact opposite. When psilocin binds to those 5-HT2A serotonin receptors, which are densely packed on layer 5 pyramidal neurons in your cortex, it doesn't dampen anything. It literally flips a switch that violently excites those neurons. It floods the cortex with signal, raising what neuroscientists call neural entropy. So your brain activity becomes dramatically less predictable, highly diverse, and profoundly desynchronized. And in doing so, it physically loosens the default mode network, that tightly coupled drain circuit that's tied to your ego and your everyday self-referential thoughts.
So if we step back and summarize the actual lived experience here, cannabis quiets and blurs. It provides this dose-dependent relaxation, alters time perception, and impairs short-term memory. Psilocybin, well, it excites and destabilizes. It creates profound perceptual changes, deep emotional introspection, and at higher doses, a complete dissolution of your ordinary sense of self. One is broadly a relaxant. The other's a total reorganization of consciousness.
All right, let's jump into section 3, dependence and brain rewiring, focusing on plasticity and tolerance. How does the physical brain actually adapt to the presence of these very different substances over time? Well, look at this stark statistic from the CDC. 3 in 10, roughly 3 out of 10 people who use cannabis develop a defined condition called cannabis use disorder. When the brain is chronically flooded with THC, it physically adapts. It downregulates and desensitizes its CB1 receptors, and this produces genuine tolerance, meaning you need more of it just to feel the same effects, and a very real withdrawal syndrome when you stop, characterized by irritability, sleep disruption, and appetite loss. And that risk climbs even steeper if the use begins in adolescence. Contrast that statistic with psilocybin. Psilocybin carries a remarkably low dependence liability. It simply does not produce a classic withdrawal syndrome. Why? Because the brain's 5-HT2A receptors downregulate almost immediately after a single dose, a biological process called tachyphylaxis. Basically, if you take psilocybin on a Tuesday, taking the exact same dose on a Wednesday is going to do very little. This mechanism structurally discourages compulsive daily use. Now, obviously, low dependence doesn't mean it's completely risk-free, but on this specific axis of physical addiction, these two are miles apart. Let's move to neuroplasticity and see how this builds over time. Both substances are often marketed as boosting plasticity, but we need to be honest about the science here. Preclinical evidence shows a single dose of psilocybin drives acute structural growth. Activating that 5-HT2A receptor triggers a specific signaling cascade, the BDNF, TRKB, mTOR pathway, which leads to the rapid growth of new dendritic spines in the frontal cortex within just 24 hours. Cannabis, conversely, approaches plasticity from the opposite direction. Your natural endocannabinoid system is already a master regulator of plasticity, but constantly flooding it with outside THC tends to override and blunt that precise tuning, which can sometimes impair cognition over time. So psilocybin promotes rapid structural growth, while chronic THC disrupts the brain's own finely calibrated system. Moving into Section 4, the clinical scoreboard. Let's look at what the evidence actually says.
So the crucial point is, why does this molecular science matter to you? It matters because it dictates whether you should be looking for daily symptom relief or a single transformative psychological intervention. You literally can't compare them head to head because they lead in entirely different clinical arenas. Cannabis has really substantial evidence for chronic pain, MS spasticity, and chemotherapy nausea, plus purified CBD for rare forms of epilepsy. Interestingly enough, the clinical evidence for cannabis treating anxiety or PTSD is actually quite weak. Psilocybin, however, leads in psychiatry. As of 2026, it boasts positive phase 3 trials for treatment-resistant depression and shows incredible promise for end-of-life cancer distress as well as addiction. In fact, think about this. Addiction is an area where cannabis is a documented risk, while psilocybin is a candidate treatment.
Of course, we absolutely have to neutrally report the hazard profiles here because natural absolutely does not mean harmless, and both of these interact significantly with psychiatric vulnerabilities. Cannabis carries risks of biphasic anxiety, meaning a low dose might calm you down, but a high dose could provoke a panic attack. There's also a contested but definitely hardening link between high-potency THC and the earlier onset of psychotic disorders, alongside cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome and some emerging data on cardiovascular events. Psilocybin's risks, on the other hand, are primarily psychological. You have the intensely challenging bad trip, rare but persistent perceptual changes known as HPPD, and a very strict medical contraindication for anyone with a personal or family history of psychosis or bipolar disorder. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, the 2026 legal landscape and where we stand today. Zooming out to the macro-societal level, we can observe how the regulatory frameworks for these two substances officially diverged, and this brilliantly illustrates the current reality. In 2026, the DEA took historic action by moving FDA-approved and state-licensed medical cannabis down to Schedule 3. However, recreational marijuana and all other forms still remain Schedule 1 federally, leaving it as this messy state-by-state patchwork. Psilocybin, meanwhile, remains strictly Schedule 1 at the federal level with absolutely no completed rescheduling. Though it is worth noting that states like Oregon and Colorado have pioneered regulated service center access frameworks. We simply report these facts to show how deeply divided the legal structures still remain. So, we'll conclude this explainer by asking you to reflect on your own goals. Which tool is the right fit for the mind you are trying to change? If you're seeking established, daily symptom relief for physical pain, well, that's the modulating world of cannabinoids. But if you're seeking a single supervised intervention to disrupt deep-seated depression, that's the entropy-raising world of psilocybin. They aren't competing medicines in some kind of race. They are entirely different tools built for entirely different jobs. As we map more of these molecular keys in the future, the ultimate question is, which doors inside your own consciousness are you ready to open? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring the incredible universe inside your head.